Hi. Before we get into the video, I just want to say that every single unpopular opinion I mentioned in this video revolves around making the LGBT community more welcoming and accessible. So if you are worried that this video would attack or malign or make fun of you or your identity, please rest assured that that isn't the case. Likewise, if you clicked on this video hoping that I would attack or malign or make fun of people, please know that that isn't the case. And regardless of why you clicked on this video, I hope that you take something positive away from it. Hello everyone, welcome back. My name's Maddie, and here on this channel, we make videos about LGBT issues, mental health, and anything else that we deem relevant and interesting. If that sounds like your cup of tea, then consider subscribing and consider supporting us on Patreon. Links in the description below. So a while back, I saw a video from a vegan YouTuber entitled My Vegan Unpopular Opinions, and I thought it was a really great educational tool for anyone interested in plant-based diets. I'll leave the link down in the description below. And after watching this video, I decided that I wanted to do one, but for opinions related to the LGBT community. I'm actually a fairly opinionated person, so I thought it might be fun to talk about some of those opinions. That being said, I'm also someone who hates conflict, so if you disagree with me on any of these, please be nice and respectful about it. And hopefully these opinions aren't as unpopular as I think they are, and we'll all agree and get along and it'll be lovely. But I've been part of this community long enough to know that that's not the case. So these unpopular opinions aren't in any particular order, but I do want to start with something that I've talked about on this channel before, which is dysphoria. Specifically, I believe that the debate about needing dysphoria to be trans is ultimately harmful. I've already made 2 videos on this topic called Do You Need Dysphoria to Be Trans? And Do You Need Euphoria to Be Trans? And it's my hope that those videos generally push people away from this whole argument rather than accidentally contributing to it. Because I feel like the question actually gets in the way of people trying to figure out who they are. At the end of the day, being trans just means that you don't 100% identify with the gender you were assigned at birth. I don't think you have to have dysphoria to come to that realization, and I also don't think you have to experience euphoria to come to that realization either. Trans people are diverse. Trans people are different. We're not a monolith, and our stories look different. That's okay. It's beyond okay. It's beautiful. The second unpopular opinion is somewhat related to the first, which is that the term transgenders is ultimately harmful to trans people and people who are trying to figure themselves out. Fortunately, I haven't heard this term in quite a while, so maybe it's died down, but just in case it's still floating around out there, I'm going to talk about it. For those of you who might be unfamiliar with this term, it refers to people, usually young people, who pretend to be trans because they want the attention or because they think it's trendy. And look, I'm not saying that those people don't exist. They very well may. But this term is used far more often to describe people who don't fit the mold of what a trans person should be. I've heard people refer to trans people who don't experience dysphoria as transgenders. I've heard people refer to all non-binary people as transgenders, and I've definitely heard the term used to describe people who are questioning their gender, trying to figure themselves out, wondering if this community is the place where they belong. I really think that we're doing everyone a disservice by trying to gatekeep within the trans community and the LGBT community as a whole. Think about it. Who actually benefits from there being fewer queer-identifying people in the world? Because I really don't think it's the LGBT community. Speaking of gatekeeping, the third unpopular opinion in this video is that aces and arrows are a part of the LGBT community. Full stop, 100%. For those of you who might be unfamiliar with these terms, asexuals, or aces, are people who don't experience sexual attraction, and aromantics, or arrows, are people who don't experience romantic attraction. And here's the thing. In order to be part of the LGBT community, you basically have to not be 3 things, which are cisgender, heterosexual, and heteroromantic. So if you're asexual, guess what? You're not heterosexual. And if you're aromantic, you're not heteroromantic. Therefore, aces and arrows are part of the LGBT community because they are not cishet. And yes, that also goes for aces and arrows who end up in straight passing relationships. Speaking of which, unpopular opinion number 4. LGBT people who are in straight passing relationships are no less valid or deserving of respect than people in queer passing relationships. I see this issue come up most often during Pride Month, when some people try to argue their belief that straight couples don't belong at Pride, and, well, First of all, unpopular opinion 4.5, I firmly believe that straight allies belong at Pride. I don't think that allies are a part of the community, which is probably unpopular opinion 4.6. But if you're committed to the ongoing fight for full equality under the law for LGBT people, I don't think there's any reason why you shouldn't be part of our celebrations. But getting back to my original point, I think it's unwise and unfair to assume that a couple is straight based on external appearances. After all, bisexual, pansexual, and other M-spec people who are attracted to multiple genders, do exist, can exist in straight-passing relationships, and most definitely do belong in queer spaces. Same for aces and arrows, still queer even if they're dating someone of the other binary gender. And lastly, trans people can be in straight relationships. Not straight passing, but 100% straight relationships, and they obviously belong to Pride. In general, I think we just need to do away with this idea that queer folks need to look a certain way, or dress a certain way, or be a certain way in order to be considered queer. There's beauty in diversity, and the sooner we realize that, the better off we'll be. Unpopular opinion number 5 is that bisexuality and pansexuality are both completely valid sexualities that are not transphobic. Apparently there's this feud going on between some bi people and some pan people where they're pointing fingers at each other and calling the other transphobic. This doesn't seem to be an issue with these communities as a whole, but it's still something that I've seen quite a few times on my Instagram timeline, so I wanted to talk about it. Here's the thing, there are more than 2 genders. That's probably still considered an unpopular opinion, but we're going to proceed as if this fact is common knowledge. If you are pansexual, that means you are attracted to all genders. Pan means all. The label of bisexual is a bit tricky though, because while bi means 2, suggesting that bi people are attracted to 2 genders and only 2 genders, the general consensus seems to be that being bi means that you are attracted to 2 or more genders. Either way, neither sexuality is inherently transphobic because both sexualities, by definition, can and do include trans and non-binary people. Doesn't mean that bi and pan people can't be transphobic because they certainly can be, but they certainly aren't inherently so. The 6th unpopular opinion I want to talk about in this video is that he/him lesbians and they/them lesbians are completely valid. While most lesbians use she/her pronouns, there are some who feel more comfortable using he/him or they/them pronouns, either because they feel more at home with non-feminine gender descriptors, or because they themselves don't identify 100% as a woman. Non-binary lesbians do exist. I think the key thing to remember here is that your pronouns don't dictate your gender identity, and your gender identity does not dictate your pronouns. No one's saying that men can identify as lesbians. We're saying that women don't have to use she/her pronouns. And when you think about it, gay men have been using she/her pronouns and other feminine descriptors such as cis, girl, bitch, and queen for decades. It's come to be normalized as a part of everyday speech throughout the queer community and among cis-het folks who like to borrow our language. But when you think about it, it's still subversive. It still challenges our understanding of gender and sexuality, still invites us to unpack the way we show up in spaces and declare our identities regardless of the identities that others may have tried to place upon us. So when queer women decide that we want to step out of the box and refer to ourselves in non-traditional ways, I think it's important to remember that we don't need anyone else's permission to do what feels best for us. For the record though, I use she/her pronouns. A lot of people seem to think that I use they/them pronouns because I make videos about non-binary issues, but nope, she/her for me. Speaking of pronouns, unpopular opinion number 7 is that neo-pronouns deserve to be respected. In English, most people use he/him pronouns, she/her pronouns, or they/them pronouns, but personal pronouns aren't limited to these 3 options. There are also ze/zir pronouns, and am pronouns, and fey/fair pronouns, and the list goes on for quite a while. These are known as neo-pronouns, with neo meaning new. And personally, I think it's beautiful that people are finding new ways to express themselves in a world that constantly denies their existence. Can it be difficult to learn neo-pronouns? Yes, it can be. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't do our best to respect them. And the most common argument I hear against neo-pronouns is they're just made up. But so is every single word of every single language that's ever been spoken, ever. It's why we add new words to the dictionary every year. Language isn't this static thing that was handed down to us from on high. It's constantly fluctuating and always changing, and as such, there's literally no reason not to respect people's pronouns. It takes just a little bit of effort on our part and can quite literally change someone else's life. In addition to respecting neo-pronouns, it's also important to respect xenogenders, which is unpopular opinion number 8. The term xenogender quite literally means foreign gender or alien gender, and it's used to describe gender identities that exist outside of our traditional understanding of what gender is and what it means for people. This can look like people whose gender identity is related to space or animals or nature or technology. While most non-binary identities relate back in some way to the male-female binary, xenogenders exist outside of this dichotomy entirely, and people coin new and innovative terms to encapsulate their lived experiences. I've already talked about my feelings about words being made up, but one common argument that's made against xenogenders is that it makes it so that cis people won't take the trans community seriously. And to be perfectly honest, I think that's a problem for cis people to wrestle with. If a trans person discovers or creates a xenogender that perfectly encapsulates who they are as a person, then they have every right to claim it proudly. The rest of the world can learn. I'm not saying that people need to memorize every new gender identity that people come up with. That would literally be impossible. But it does mean that we need to respect the identities of the people we come in contact with. Unpopular opinion number 9 is that LGBT people aren't immune from being racist, sexist, ableist, etc. Every single person exists at the intersection of several different identities, and that creates a complex reality where you can be marginalized in some ways, yet participate in marginalization and oppression in other ways. Being queer or being trans doesn't rule out the possibility that we might engage in thoughts and behaviors that are racist or sexist or ableist. And for that matter, being queer or being trans doesn't rule out the possibility that we might be homophobic or transphobic. In fact, I would argue that every single person watching this video right now has been racist or sexist or ableist or homophobic or transphobic at some point in our lives. Why? Because most of us, if not all of us, live in a society that is all of those things. At least here in America, where I live, society is largely built for white, cis, straight, able-bodied, neurotypical Christian men with money, and the further away from that standard you are, the more likely you are to experience oppression and marginalization. But all of us living here, regardless of race or class or creed, internalize white supremacy from the society that we live in. Same with misogyny, classism, queerphobia, you name it. All of us learn things that are harmful, all of us engage in harmful behaviors, whether intentional or not, and all of us have a duty to unlearn them. And lastly, unpopular opinion number 10 is that LGBT issues are not adult topics and shouldn't be treated as such. I see this opinion most commonly among self-proclaimed allies who say, I support the LGBT community, but I don't want my children exposed to it. As a result, people who think along these lines tend to be opposed to things like queer representation in cartoons and people coming out as queer at younger ages. But here's the thing, queer young people exist. Queerness is not an adult phenomenon, and there are few things more harmful to a queer child than growing up and believing that they're alone in the world. I think the important thing to remember is that queer identity is not about what happens behind closed doors. I've seen so many instances of queer folks being reduced to sexual acts that we're assumed to engage in, but queerness is about love. It's about being proud of who we are despite the shame that's enforced upon us. It's about community, it's about culture, it's about subverting people's expectations of what people have to be. It's about identity. There's so much more to who we are than what cis-hets think we do. And I think that every queer child everywhere in the world deserves to know that they belong to a rich, beautiful tapestry of interwoven stories united by the courage to be who we are in a world that constantly tells us who we ought to be. Regardless of where you stand, I hope you learned something from this video. If you did, make sure you leave a comment down below. I'm really curious to hear your thoughts. Please do be respectful though, as I am adamant about keeping the comment section as safe as possible for people who are figuring themselves out and asking genuine questions. Also, if you want to see a part 2, just let me know. As I mentioned earlier, I'm a very opinionated person, and I can always share more opinions upon request if that's something you'd be interested in. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you like this video and subscribe if you want to see more content just like this. And if you want to support the work we do on this channel, consider supporting us on Patreon, links in the description below. But most importantly, remember that you're wonderful, and that the world is a better place because you're in it. And as always, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you again in the next video. Bye!